Good afternoon. I am Dr. Jen Sudul Edwards, Chief Curator and Curator of Contemporary Art at the Mint Museum, and I am very honored to be joined today by the extraordinary Los Angeles artist, Gisela Colón. Thank you so much for joining us, Gisela.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to take you guys into the studio and talk about my practice and have a conversation with Jen and answer questions. So let's do it.
So that's basically going to be the format that we're going to follow. I'm going to play a video of Gisela taking us through her remarkable desert area studio out in Duarte, California. It's really an extraordinary experience. I hate to put you in this position, Gisela, but I'm hoping that we can bring some collectors out there the next time the Mint is in Los Angeles, because it really is. It blew my mind when I came out there to visit with you.
Of course, my pleasure.
And then we're going to hear from Gisela. She'll walk us through a slide presentation talking about her career and her evolution and her life as an artist and as a person. And then we are going to have a little chat amongst ourselves and then move into some questions and answers that many of you Mint members sent in before. I'm sorry we won't be able to get to everyone, but we called as many as we could from the list. So thank you so much to everyone who sent them in, and hopefully we'll get to most of them. Okay. I am going to share my screen and start the video.
Hello, everybody. I'm in front of my studio, which is located in Duarte, California, in kind of East Los Angeles County. And behind me, you see the San Gabriel Mountains, and it's a beautiful spring day in Southern California. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of the studio, so follow me. You can view part of the process as to how we sculpt and mold the acrylic material to create my wall works, which I call generally pods. So here you can see a mold created out of wood, plywood, that has been sculpted to tool the plastic material, tool the acrylic as we call it. And now we're going to be pumping air into the mold, and this process is called blow molding. And now you can see how the air will be pressuring the material downward and forming the apex of the sculpture. The air goes through the valve, goes through the top of the tool or mold into various holes, and the air is evenly spread out throughout the mold so that it evenly sculpts the plastic material. And now we're on the other side of the factory where you can see in operation a bandsawing process where one of the formed layers of acrylic is going to be sculpted. The trademark of my practice has been the use of a fluid color theory to create objects that embody transformation and change over time. My monoliths contain a jewel-like refractive surface that is composed of microscopic jewel-like fragments that reflect the light outwards into the world and cause movement and change over time to the surface. And then my wall works, which are prime examples of the fluid color spectrum that I developed, have been influenced by practitioners that came before me such as Jesus Rafael Soto, which embodied movement into his color, Carlos Cruz Diez, which created physichromies in the 60s that altered the perceptual aspect of color as the viewer moved around the object. And most importantly, I have been influenced by Donald Judd's color theory. In 1993, the last essay he wrote before he passed was about his multicolored works and how he wanted monochrome triads and double monochromes to exist all at once. He wanted multiple colors to be present all at once, but he did not want them to mix. He wanted a multiplicity that had not been known before. And in my case, I springboarded off of this theory, and I created a fluid color spectrum where multiple colors coexist at once. But in my example, the colors are fluid and mix with the light and become fused together in an indeterminate format. So here you see my hyperellipsoid barium copper, which is installed at LA Louvre in their 45 at 45 anniversary exhibition. And it illustrates a significant example of how the fluid color spectrum operates. So as the viewer moves around the object, the colors become fused with each other in the light, and it shows the variability and mutability of the sculpture. It's all about capturing the magic and the mystery and pulling the viewer into the work. And here you can see one of my parabolic monoliths installed in Saudi Arabia in the magnificent desert of Al Ula, which is a historic canyon that had been closed to Western civilization for thousands of years, and it dates back to the time of the incense root. In this installation, you can see how the monoliths can create a real sense of awe and mystery when juxtaposed to the natural surroundings of the earth and of the desert. Titled "The Future is Now," this sculpture stood as a beacon of transformation, renewal, and hope, adding an even greater dimension to the already culturally rich history of this spectacular geological region. So what's really interesting about the monoliths is that they present a duality and a polarity of conditions. So they really hark back to ancient and primitive civilizations, totems, ancient architectures such as the pyramids, archaeological treasures such as Stonehenge. And this combination of ancient with futuristic properties is what really makes them dynamic sculptures. So I've imbued this kind of primal form with qualities of the modern era, like refractive surfaces, carbon fiber construction, and just that juxtaposition causes kind of a sense of awe and heightened sense of mystery and the unknown that really harks to kind of the cosmological and a sense of going back to our origins, and we're all trying to find connections to the universe and where we came from, and kind of like reminiscent of the stars and the beginning of everything. The other interesting point about these sculptures is the transformation of aggressive masculine energy into positive female energy. So I take what at first glance seems like a phallic object, an object that is reminiscent of bullets, of projectiles, of rockets, of things that traditionally had been deemed aggressive. And I tie it with a soft, reflective surface that basically softens the environment. So by imbuing these sculptures with this radiant, reflective surface, it basically channels this positive energy out into the world, very similarly to what Judy Chicago's atmospheric works did in the 1960s. She wanted to channel this kind of feminist female spirit out into the world and radiate positive energy. And by taking these kind of masculine forms and imbuing them with this feminine energy, I basically created a conduit for transformation and change and kind of making a positive impact into the world.
Thank you, Gisela, for filming that video for us so we can all get a sneak peek into your studio process and leave our computers and take a little visit to sunny California for a few minutes.
Yeah, so now I guess we go into a PowerPoint and I have to share my screen, right?
Yep, you should be able to. It should be open.
Just share screen. Let's see. Jen, can you see it?
No.
Desktop. Let's see.
There you go.
Okay, can we see that now? Yes,
Yes.
here we are. Okay, so I prepared a PowerPoint for you guys to give an overview, and it has 70 slides to be exact, so you know how many we're going to cover, and gives you an idea, right? And I'm just going to kind of move quickly because this is supposed to be kind of just an overview. But here's an image of the work at the Mint Museum in the In Vivid Color exhibition, and it's just a casual image, but it shows you what kind of we're going to be talking about today, which is my sculptural process and where it comes from. And by way of background, I grew up in Puerto Rico, which is a small island in the Caribbean. Puerto Rico is a Spanish colony. It was a Spanish colony for hundreds of years, 400 plus years, and then it became kind of a pseudo colony of the United States. And it's a beautiful island with lots of, you know, Spanish architecture and modern architecture. Here's some of the old Spanish colonial architecture, rocks, very amazing color palette in Old San Juan in the streets. A lot of this color palette kind of intrinsically is in my work, and it's kind of embedded in my mind as I grew up there as a child. It has incredible kind of biological and flora and fauna. Here is a picture of El Yunque rainforest, which is an amazing rainforest brimming with lots of life and plants. Here's another example of kind of ancient rock formations that are on the island, and this is called Las Cuevas de Camuy, which is these prehistoric caves, and it really kind of has a sense of just the geological time that you experience on the island. You know, it gives you a sense of the past. And also the skies feel really low, like the light and the sense of presence that the sky has is pretty dramatic when you're down on the island. And also there's these ecological wonders, like this is the fluorescent bay in Lajas, which is brimming with this kind of microscopic little creatures. And when you get out of the ocean, your entire body glows, and you have these microscopic creatures that are all over your skin. And at night you get this incredible glow in the ocean. And there's lots of sea creatures. Here you have like jellyfishes, which are called aguavivas. And the fauna is really wild. Like here is a plant called morivivi, and when you touch the leaves close up. They're kind of like those plants that eat bugs, you know. It's pretty amazing how the life is just really activated down there. And coqui, this is a little frog that only lives in Puerto Rico, and they've taken him out of Puerto Rico all over places in the world, like Hawaii, and he will not live outside the island. So it's one of these kind of mysteries that I remember encountering as a child that I thought, God, just the nature is so amazing, you know. And this is the sense of wonder that I draw from in my practice. I grew up kind of with a wild childhood with all kinds of animals and plants, and the physical world around me was really pervasive. And here I am at the age of 4 with a rooster, my little pet rooster. So I really had no fear of animals or plants. It was really kind of just a really immersive childhood. And most 4-year-olds wouldn't play with the rooster because they get their eyes pecked out. But I think I just I just really enjoyed it. So here I was a young artist from a very young age. And I think this is one of the questions that somebody had asked, like, when did you start your artistic tendencies? And it was at the age of 4, around 4 years old. My mother was an amateur painter, so I would be her hands-on assistant and I would help her paint. And we painted hundreds of paintings over the years. And here's an example of one of the paintings that I worked on heavily. I'm 6 years old in this image, and it's a painting of the sugarcane safra. The safra is the harvest where the sugarcane gets trimmed and cut and processed. And we would drive to the side of the road in Puerto Rico and park and just go and observe people working and cutting. And then we'd go back home and we'd try to paint what we experienced out in nature. And we did a lot of heavily it was oil on wood and it was impasto and we used knives. And I used that technique of layering, I realized, all throughout my artistic practice. So not only did I start layering at a young age, but then it became kind of my early paintings. And then that layering applies to my wall works, like the one at the Mint, and also to the carbon fiber monoliths that I make today. So that whole stratification and layering was very early on. Eventually, I graduated University of Puerto Rico, economics, and I studied law, not because I wanted to study law, but because we were fairly poor and I had no money at some point, and I really felt like law was going to kind of get me out for practical reasons. And I moved to Los Angeles where I studied law, but eventually my artistic practice then came back and I decided, well, this is what I really want to do. And this is kind of go back to my roots and really be a professional artist. So I was able to do that, thank God, because our law was just very dry and I was never really, that was not my thing. But anyway, Los Angeles being the most amazing metropolis full of energy, which I love and I draw from, this whole sense of movement, change, transformation that you experience in Los Angeles is really incredible. To go from a small tropical island to this vast, diverse, flattened space where everybody's always moving and gyrating. And it's like a very peripatetic lifestyle that you feel in the city. And all of that kind of goes into my work also, because I draw from all my surroundings. And Los Angeles was defined really in the 1960s by the space age movement. So all of this new technology, new advancements in travel and materials, that all became incorporated into the aesthetic of the Los Angeles artists. And from the 60s on to today, we still utilize that. And I tap into that kind of really technological modernist vibe by using cutting edge materials in my artwork. So that's kind of at the root of the work as well. It's kind of what they call, the Los Angeles aesthetic, cool school, light and space, finish fetish, all of those terms that apply. And obviously the aerospace technology is pretty prevalent in Southern California. And there's a sense of these open spaces that you get in the West that you really don't get elsewhere. It's this vast kind of just sense of the sky above you that really is pervasive, the sense of the light, the way that, you just kind of, it reminds you of your own mortality because you get a sense of the geological age of the planet when you're out in the middle of nowhere. And that's a really wonderful kind of feeling that I access in my work. I try to bring about that sense of kind of experience of geological time. And also the skies are pretty incredible because out in the West, you can connect with the cosmological realm, with the stars, with the universe beyond. And I put that into my work, and my work is pretty much, I have my wall works, and then I also have these monolithic kind of singular totemic works that I make. And my trademark is that they're all kind of humanized geometries. So like they're geometric forms that have been altered by hand, modified to basically become more amorphous and just kind of a lifelike. I'm looking to kind of put the life into the work. And here you see some wall works, which I call pods, and you see a monolith that kind of has that nice fluid lines to it. This is the piece, this is the Hyperlipsod Azure Gold, which is a prime example of my work. And this is the one at the Mint. And I developed over time what I call a fluid color spectrum. And this is the work in natural lighting. And as you can see, as you move around the object, then you get like a real transformational sense of the color changing. and also the form inside. So from certain angles, the form disappears and reappears, and that's what I've called my fluid color spectrum. And the fluid color spectrum historically comes from several different sources of inspiration. Some of the Latin American optical artists, like in this example here is Carlos Cruz Diez, which he invented his sense of physichromies in the 60s, where you would walk around and the various strips of color would alter your perception of color in and of itself. So Carlos Cruz Diez has been an inspiration, as well as Jesus Rafael Soto, who basically embodied movement into the color. So that sense of color moving in space. And of course, the West Coast's, light and space masters, such as James Turrell, which have these immersive environments of color, and Dan Flavin, East Coast minimalist, and also has the color kind of pervading into the space, even though in Dan Flavin's example, you can see the light source, which are the tubes. And in Turrell's, you don't see the source, but it's kind of similar in the way that they pervade the space with that movement of color. And also Donald Judd, which I talk about in the studio visit video, which, Judd basically talks about his multicolored works as having all of the colors present at once, but not blending, not mixing. And I jumped off of his color theory, this essay that he wrote in 1993 before he passed away. And I said, well, what if I can have a variety of colors present all at once, but they fuse with the light, they mix with the light, and they become fluid and indeterminate. So that's what I was going for in my fluid color spectrum. So Judd has also been an inspiration in that regard, and his color theory. And also the color spectrum is present in my monoliths. Now the monoliths, the color spectrum is a little bit more tenuous. It's not as dramatic as the wall works, because I want the form, this kind of pristine, reductive form to shine. So when you look at the monoliths, you really are taken by this reductive form, and it's an advancement in the theory of minimal objects, because basically it has no corners, no lines, no demarcations, no parts, no 90-degree angles, no place for the eyes to rest. So in that sense, it differs from prior minimal sculpture, where usually in the tradition of minimalism, both East Coast and West Coast, you have sculptures that have edges to them, or corners, or they're boxes, so this is kind of, in my view, an advancement of that discourse of the minimal object and how far you can take it. So it's really kind of slippery. And my monoliths, let's see, this is a piece in Saudi Arabia, which is much larger in scope, and it also activated by the light depending on the time of day. Here you see it's the sun's rays are coming sideways, so the piece becomes much more activated. The surface particles become like prisms, and they fragment the light, so you get a really incredible prismatic vibe at that point. Here, let me just go to the next one. And the history of the monoliths also stems from ancient things like Stonehenge, the early civilization structures like Egyptian obelisks, Roman columns, Pompey's pillar, Trajan's column, these single kind of unitary works that have existed in the past history. Even the pyramids of Giza are very incredible in the sense that they're monolithic in form. So they've all been inspiration to me in forming this singular unity of a sculpture. And it also, these monoliths talk about not only the past, but the present and the future, and looking forward to something that is hopeful. We're moving into the future, not just dwelling on the past. And the immediate modern era precursors would be, for example, Richard Serra's planks in Qatar. These are kind of referenced in the modern era. Michael Heiser's levitated rock at LACMA, which is very singular, but at the same time geological. Michael Heiser's The City, which I'm very excited that we would get access to eventually to visit. The precedent of these very large scale geometric forms has been very inspirational. Also, Nancy Holt's sun tunnels. I love the sun tunnels because not only are they kind of really minimal and singular objects, but they go beyond because they align with the forces of the cosmos above. So she basically speaks to connecting with the stars, the sun, the moon. And of course, Robert Smithson's spiral jetty is an example of kind of that movement and transformation of sculpture over time, because it's a living, breathing, transformative sculpture. The water fluctuates up and down over the years and the decades, and it really is dramatic, the change. Like, look at it here in this picture. And then here, look at it. This was probably like 10 years ago when the water was much higher and you had salt forming on top of the spiral. I mean, it really is wonderful. And I had a chance to visit a few years ago, and the water was much lower down, and the rocks were exposed again. But look at the color shift in the sky. I mean, it's really an amazing precedent for changing and transformation. And of course, James Turrell volcano, the Rodin crater, basically taps into the whole use of the elliptical form to elicit connections to the sky. So it allows humans to connect from below to the sky above and the cosmological realm. Judd, the concrete boxes are incredible examples, again, of geometrical singular forms on the earth. The aluminum boxes also communicate with the sun. As the sun moves around during the day, you get this amazing sense of reflection and refraction and bringing the outdoors in. And my good friend Dwayne Valentine, who's been a mentor to me over the last decade, his 12-foot columns have been inspirational. They're just so pristine and so beautiful. You know, even though they're so kind of squared off, which is what I was talking about, you still get that sense of almost like a piece of the sky, you know? And McCracken's reflective columns, because they bring the exterior environment in, are also valuable precedent. Robert Irwin's prismatic columns. This is a column from 1967, which is cast acrylic, one of his first. And Doug Wheeler's synthetic desert environment. This was installed at the Guggenheim about 4 years ago, and they allowed people to go in for like 5 minutes. And I was lucky enough that I booked something on the 4th of July at the end of the day when it was the last period to go, and they allowed me to stay in there for 30 minutes. And it was incredible because literally you felt connected to the desert, even though you're in this room, and it was just complete silence, no color. And it was really an incredible experience. And the way that Wheeler also tries to connect to the cosmological forces. And also valuable precedent have been women. There are very few women who have tackled minimalism. East Coast minimalism, it was like Anne Truitt was the sole minimalist. And she always got segregated intellectually from the men by Greenberg, because Greenberg always said, oh, the painted surface, you know, he was a consummate supporter of painting. He didn't like the new sculpture, but by segregating her and calling her work emotional and trying to plug her and help her, he actually did a disservice, because he segregated her from the tough intellectual discourse that men like Judd were having. And so it definitely, that's why I think she has never been as recognized as the men. And part of it was Greenberg's treatment of her. And on the West Coast, we have Helen Pashtian, whose fabulous use of light this is a column installation at LACMA that was like four years ago. And James Turrell, interestingly, I have a quote I want to read from him when he talks about Helen. He says, Turrell says, I worked with light and sort of materialized the light. Bob Irwin worked with material and dematerialized it into light aspects. Helen was the one who, as a sculptor, spiritualized the material world. You can sort of materialize the spiritual, but she was coming from the opposite direction. And I thought that was really interesting and beautiful in her work. So that's Helen. And we have Mary Kors, who's also a good friend, and she discovered the use of micro glass beads that attract the light and reflect it back out. So her work is kind of a precedent to mine in the sense of taking the light and reflecting it back into the eye. And she's just fantastic. I love Mary. But all of these women, none of them, if you look at Helen's work and Mary's, they basically took their identity out of the work because it wasn't cool back then in the 60s to even say anything about being a woman. Like, you really had to try and make work that looked like men's work. So that brings me to Judy Chicago. Judy Chicago, who I love, she had a whole minimal period in the 60s where she did like these totemic sculptures, and she did, there she is when she's younger, and here she did these gold domes, which are iridescent and they kind of have layers. And she also did these colorful blocks, and she talks about how she in the 60s was trying to make work that looked like a man had done it to be accepted. And so I studied all of this and I said, well, why is it that there are no other women really kind of pursuing this minimal discourse? And it's because identity was frowned upon. And now enter the 21st century, where I purposefully put the life into my sculpture. I purposefully don't shy away from identity. And I think that's a really, really cool thing to be able to move beyond that. Judy Chicago's atmospheres were also valuable precedent in the sense that she would go out in the desert and have these amazing kind of smoke works that were, she called atmospheres. And she said, I'm trying to feminize the environment and put an impulse into the world that is positive and changing. And that's what I try to do with my monoliths. It's sort of like this very heavy masculine object that then the surface becomes prismatic and it puts that female, feminine, or softer, or just a positive impulse into the world. And also, they kind of have a sense of transformation throughout time. So here you have a view of the monolith at night, which is very different than during the day when the life is activating the sculpture. And other inspirations have been sculptors like Linda Benglis, who also has these amorphous liquid forms. Obviously, Yayoi Kusama's tentacles, which are really lifelike and they're kind of moving up into the sky. And there's also aspects of the future. So not only the past and the immediate past, but going towards the future and drawing from universal energy. So this is, for example, the energy that's contained in atomic particles, where we have elliptical forms coming out of that, the energy contained inside our cells. So, you know, even the biological forces that make us, you see this wonderful trajectory of elliptical forms that are looping onto each other. And I draw from that. I draw from the universe macroscopically and the world all around us, the skies, the stars, the movement of the planets. Everything that's out there beyond the earth is amazing. The sense of energy that you can draw from and put it into the work and try to channel that out into the world. And basically everything that is space and time is really the universe. And I go broader and broader from the microscopic all the way to the macroscopic, which is about just constant expansion of space and time. And that's pretty much it, just pursuing the universal and at its core and trying embedding it into the work. So hopefully this has been a good overview of my practice. And Jen, let's have a chat.
Oh, how to drill down from the universe, the universal down to the terrestrial world in which we live. Thank you, Gisela. That was fascinating. And as we discussed previously, I had seen you give a similar talk when you were talking about your show at the Taubman, which was extraordinary. And I just find so fascinating the connections that you have in Puerto Rico and like all of those ancient rock formations and that sort of tough, hard, and durable in the true sense of the word duration, right? Like these are ancient formations next to all of that flora and fauna, which holds its presence because it's so beautiful and it's so reactive. And as you said, you know, like it reacts even to the like most subtle changes in the environment, like touch or the sun. And yet it's constantly changing and growing. And it made me think about how your monoliths are works that I find most alive, most vivacious when they break out of gallery spaces and are living in the external world. The images of the monoliths in the desert, particularly the ones where they're situated against rock formations. I mean, I just find that so fascinating in the, of course, in the conflict between these very natural forms in all ways, and then these hyper industrial, technologically infused forms that you're creating.
Yeah, well, that juxtaposition you're talking about is precisely what we were trying to achieve in the desert in Saudi Arabia. So that you have that kind of that jolt of like, oh my God, I'm alive, and I, look at the past and look at these rock formations that are eons old, like when humans were not even around on the earth. And then, wow, look at this super futuristic thing here that catapults you. It's to the future. It's meant for you to be triggered into thinking about your life and moving it from the past into the future. It's just kind of supposed to be kind of like developing like an awakening of sorts. So like you really think about time as an experience, as part of your life. A lot of people go through life and they're not that aware of even the passage of time.
Well, especially when we are predominantly now living in cities or, places that don't have those kinds of markers. Even, I mean, we have less trees around us. So even the feeling of seasons isn't quite as poignant as it is when you live amongst a forest.
Right.
I mean, it's profound. But I was wondering too, if those sculptures, if you would leave them out there like forever, would you just leave a monolith in the desert in Saudi Arabia and then see how it ages or doesn't age over time?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I've never pondered that, but you would have to allow entropy to take hold, which is something that Michael Heiser talks about. Like if you study his double negative, at the beginning, the double negative was perfectly sliced. And then now when I visited, it was like 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of the rocks had fallen, the shape had changed. I mean, it would basically be allowing the sculpture to go through the entropy and just become eventually destroyed. I mean, after eons. I mean, I'm not talking in an immediate way, but you're talking thousands of years later, you don't know what's going to happen, Yeah, it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, because I feel like you listed so many artists that are so interestingly connected to your own practice and your own lineage, right? Like it's not just the work that you're making, but also the questions you're pursuing. But I feel like your work is most closely tied to those sculptors who are working just as comfortably, if not more so, in the natural world. Like, Cruz Diaz and Soto and Heiser. Like, I feel like those works really come alive when you have that juxtaposition between the natural world and this other challenge that you're creating in your this technologically constructed artwork. Like, I feel like
it's really taking the art. It's taking the art and making it an environmental proposition. Land art or an environment, taking it out of the white walls and basically letting it become alive.
Well, that communication between the natural world and the art construction, like that Nancy Holt was the perfect example of it, right? Like, that is, it comes alive when you realize that this is made not only in response to, but in conversation with the natural world.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So that's part of it. That's very intrinsic in my work. The monoliths, you're right, they're much more activated outside, but if you take my wall works too, I mean, they still have an incredible range of activation indoors, and they can still communicate that sense of what I'm trying to do when you bring it inside, that sense of the cosmological realm contained inside those sculptures. So even inside of a museum or inside of a gallery, the viewer can still experience that kind of energy of life coming out of the sculpture.
And that is repeatedly what I've heard from our audience members, which is fascinating because like, it's not often that you have an audience respond in exactly the way that the artist intends them to respond. But I mean, that's really like people who experience it. And I have to say, and I've told you this numerous times, but just for the record, because we're being recorded, that Hyperellipsoid has become like one of the favorite works in the museum during this time. And it was only included in this temporary exhibition. And we are so fortunate to have the generosity of Miss Pamela Banks from Los Angeles and you, Gisela, for helping us with that relationship, that we now have the work permanently in our collection, which is incredible because so many of our audience members exactly have that experience. Like they stand in front of it and they're just mesmerized by the beauty, but as they walk around it, that phenomenological experience that they have, everyone says they feel like it is this out-of-body experience where they're catapulted through this like cosmic world of experiences just in that brief walk around. I mean,
well, interesting. One of the questions you sent me from Joff Cohen from Charlotte, he said, what feelings do you hope people will leave with after experiencing your artwork? And so we're just talking about this, so we might as well continue on that question, which is that jolt of energy and of life, and just bring you into a sense of connection to the world, connection to the universe, the forces of life from in your cells, out in the sky. And that's what I hope that people would experience. So it really makes me happy, Jen, that you're relating that people have experienced something of that nature. Makes me very pleased.
Yeah, it's been a beautiful time watching people have that very emotional connection with a work that feels spiritual and cosmological at the same time, because I mean, this is what is kind of greeting people as they emerge from the pandemic, from all of this time in their homes. So it's been even more both fraught and also a relief for them to experience this beauty, but also this out-of-body experience through the piece.
Great. So should we answer some more questions?
Let's do it. So shall we start with this first one, which relates to this? Your work has a great physical presence. How do you determine scale and form?
Scale, it's very interesting because I move from small scale to large scale. Like you see the piece behind me, behind my head is the smallest kind of scale I work in, but it's kind of this, still has concentrated energy. So it's not like I set about to say I'm only going to work in large scale or only small scale. I can move into scale, but the one requirement is that the work has to have that impulse of energy in it. If I'm making a work and I see it's not achieving it, then I'm going to abandon that. And so, I can just work fluidly in this different scale.
What is your hit ratio? Do you feel like you abandon many pieces or no?
I think the abandonment occurred early on in my practice when I was first developing the forms, and some of them just didn't work as well. And I remember saying, okay, that's just not going to work. But now I've become more, over the years, you just become more knowledgeable about your own, your own goals. And my eye has become refined. So I can look at something right away and know if the color's working or if it's not, or if the light's, working in it or not. And so it's just, I think, experience.
And that's led to this kind of intuition that the work is going to be successful.
Right. Intuition for sure.
So this kind of connects with the conversation around your work in the world. Do you make pieces site specific or are they generally movable?
Some of them are generally movable, and the larger scale works like the one in Saudi Arabia was very site specific. So I developed that one thinking of the scale that it was going to be juxtaposed to the rocks and the mountains and the whole feeling of the whole area. So some of them are going to be site specific, but for the most part, the wall works are movable. And that's part of the intrinsic amazing thing about the works, is that because they're mutable objects, because they change depending on their environmental location, available light throughout the day, natural versus artificial light, the position of the viewer, it's like I allow the works to be in different settings, because then you can have a wider range of experience, of perceptual experience that you can access, you know?
Yeah. This kind of reminds me, I meant to tell you, one of the goals when we reinstall hyperellipsoid in the galleries, in the permanent collection galleries, is to make sure that it's in front of a window so it can have that natural light. But I also wanted to install it near Anne Truitt.
Oh my God.
I know, so you'd be in direct conversation with her.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's going to be great, the conversation.
Especially,
by the way, what color is the Anne Truitt?
A deep, like indigo purple.
Oh my God, that's
that
great.
would actually will play off beautifully with that purple sheen that you get when you're right on the side of the azure gold. Yeah, I think it's gonna be powerful.
Can't wait to see it.
So a question from one of our actual local artists, Angela Dia, who has a show up in the museum right now. How has it been for you staying creative during the pandemic and quarantine?
You know, I remember when it first started, I just put myself in the mindset that I said, I just have to continue creating. That was my one thing. Just wake up every day and do something, you know, whether it be drawing, whether it be thinking. I mean, I worked all throughout the pandemic, and my source of solace was that, just the go-to of creating and working, and then also nature. So whenever I get so frustrated, like, you know, you just feel like you're going to burst from from inertia, because everything was stopped. And it was just literally go out and be in nature, find nature somehow. And I started filming all sorts of plants, you know, trees, leaves, movement. And then I started filming the sunrise every day on a time lapse. And I created a couple of videos called Existential Time, which addressed the sense of inertia and addressed the sense of like paralysis that the humans were feeling. But then when you looked at the sky and you were recording the events around you, like the sun, something as simple as the sun or the moon, it just brought about that realization that our human time is so, our concept of human time, we think it's so important, when in reality it's so small and not as significant as the geological time of the earth. So it just kind of brought my awareness into being of like putting into place what's really important, you know, because then you realize how even though our human activity was stopped, time really didn't stop on the planet. Everything continues, you know. It just made me feel more connected, you know, to be outside.
Yeah, that's beautiful, that human experience is not going to start or stop the world around us in any way. Is anything going to come out of those film works that you did?
Yeah, we exhibited them at the exhibition I had at Gavilac, Palm Beach in January. So yeah, they were exhibited along with the body of work that I produced during the quarantine, which are these flattened rectanguloids. That was kind of a sense of flattening time. And it was a great combination of the film and then the wall works.
Do you think it's time specific, or will you continue pursuing the video work now?
You know, now that I've done it, I feel like there's definitely something that I'm going to continue to do.
Yeah.
Let's see where it takes me. I mean, I always look for new things. And one of the questions that
I was going to say, this is a good segue.
This is a good segue for D. Hancock. He said, it can be hard for me to resist the allure of new art supplies, but I try. What's your favorite art tool and why? And has this changed since you first learned that you love to create? It's a fascinating question, because as we were talking about in my PowerPoint, when I first started creating, it was very traditional oil paintings on wood, and then slowly going through this whole transformation and this process of immersing myself in the scene in Southern California and getting to know a lot of the light and space artists. And that propelled me to start examining new materials and always looking for kind of what's the next thing, what can I use to create? And that led me to the optical acrylics, and then that led me to the carbon fiber to be able to work in larger scale. So I've never stopped pursuing new materials and new tools. And one of the tools that I love, in direct response to Hancock's question, is the whole system of CAD that is utilized by architects, you know, the CAD drawing and 3D modeling. So you can actually like my monoliths are created in this 3D system, so you can see it perfectly and it's flawless. And then that drawing then becomes the sculpture. So I love this tool of being able to fluidly create in a computer, and then it gives you more freedom. So I would say always pursue new things. My advice to any artist would be just pursue and see where it takes you.
Had you worked in film before? Or was that just started during the pandemic?
This just started during the pandemic, and it was a new vehicle.
Huh? Was it your iPhone?
Yeah. I have the latest iPhone, which is amazing, the footage you can get on that.
So do you feel like that is another example, like something as, quotidian as our phone is opening up?
Absolutely, as quotidian, because what you get is just a new way of expressing yourself, Yeah. Just never say no to technology is what I would say.
No matter how much it scares you.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of the technology, one of the questions that I'm constantly getting in the galleries, and it was sent in, is how do you create the works and make the color feel so alive?
Oh, my magic secret.
Crack the box as much as you want, Gisela. Slam the lid down. No. You don't need everything.
No, in a nutshell, I'll try and explain it without giving away what I call the secret juice. The secret juice, everybody says, I call it juice because it's in reference to electricity, juice being electrical. People sometimes think, they say, are the works plugged into the wall, or did they have a source of electricity? And I say no, and that's where people are fascinated with the how-to, like, how did you do it, And in a nutshell, I'll give you, I started working with optical acrylics and materials. I wanted to get rid of the paint because I thought, Craig Kaufman had painted vacuum formed reliefs, and I said, I need to shed the paint and find a way of expressing myself that doesn't replicate what other artists have done, and to try and come up with something new. And that's when I started forming different layers of acrylics and putting them one on top of the other and seeing what was happening with the light. So it's kind of, imagine babushka dolls, the little dolls, nesting dolls. And so that's what I started doing. So each piece of mine has 5, 6, 7, 8 layers of different materials that I laminate and layer one on top of the other, which has air in between the layers, and it acts as a prism. So that's what it is in a nutshell. It's the light goes through the layers, it reflects out into the world, it refracts, and it becomes a prismatic. It's almost like a prism, like if you take a prism outside and you get the rainbow. So that's what these sculptures are about. It's just a prismatic object that creates this fluid color spectrum.
Which is why the color changes as you move around the sculpture.
Exactly. And then I can play with that. I have all these different materials I use to create different color spectrums, different nucleus colors, which is the center focal point of the sculpture. But I would say to anybody asking the question is, there's a habit in Western civilization of always trying to figure out how everything is made or done. And that's not necessarily the best way to experience art, because then your mind goes to the how-to rather than the what. So maybe you should just quiet your mind and stand in front of the sculpture and just experience it for what it is without having to think so much. Do you know what I mean? Because that's what we're really trying to do, to get you to stop thinking and to just live and to experience something.
Tom Waits has this great quote, let's just wonder.
Yes.
Like, let's stop looking everything up on our phones and let's just wonder.
Yes, that feeling of just pure experience without so much analysis,
Yeah. Which unfortunately leads us to our next question, which is hyper analytical, which is, from Michael Gallus, one of our trusty collections committee members. Do you feel your work encapsulates the female experience as it relates to creating life through conception and childbirth, as only a woman artist can represent it? And this came about because I actually was giving Michael a tour of In Vivid Color, and we spent a great deal of time in front of your sculpture. When I sent that offer from Pamela Banks to the collections committee, I included a whole dossier on the work and on you. And he responded immediately, just completely in love with the work, marveling at it. And so I invited him over to spend time with it. And that was one of the things that he consistently went back to, is the idea of the nucleus in the center of the pod, and how that so much felt like it was both being protected, but also had this relationship to the mother and child, and this very like direct relationship, but also that moment of birth inside and expanding outward.
Well, it's very interesting because it's really, again, this is where the viewer can complete the artwork. So like Michael had that experience of maybe a mother giving birth or conception, or the female aspect of reproduction and of life. But yet my work, I really strive to be gender fluid in the sense that I can access any aspect of life. So all the way down from the birth of a seed, the seed that generates a plant, which is not necessarily gender oriented, to a phallic object like the monolith, which is kind of masculine, and it has references to the male dominated strength. So I really strive to not be pegged or pigeonholed into saying this is from the point of view of a woman. And by the way, I have to say something on childbirth and conception. You know, Judy Chicago, who's the consummate feminist, she did a whole series of paintings on childbirth, and she herself never had children. She never gave birth, but yet she was able to experience that by proxy. So she went and she watched people being born, women giving birth. So she experienced it not through her eyes, but through the eyes of another, in a sense. And she says, look, people are capable of experiencing every aspect of life on the planet and not necessarily being stuck to their body or their, you know, their particular gender identity. So I think I want to, like what I want to say is that I can run the gamut, that it's not limited to a woman's experience, that it's really the human experience that I'm going for, and that each viewer can ascribe meaning based on their perception, their feelings, and none of it is good or bad. It's just simply the widest possible range of the human experience, both intellectually and perceptually, that I'm going for. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I love most about your works, particularly the hyperellipsoids, is that I feel like when I'm looking at the pods, I genuinely feel like I'm experiencing this broad range of time, like this primordial to cosmic, but it has nothing to do with humans necessarily. And that's, I feel like there's this great relief that I'm experiencing a work that's not just about human experience, but is in fact about this all worldly experience, not otherworldly, but all worldly.
Yeah, all worldly, and I keep on all worldly, and I also keep on going back to this whole concept of the source of life. You know, at some point we were all stardust. You know, at some point, where did we come from? We came from the Big Bang, you know, over eons of time, and that matter then transformed itself and eventually became planets and galaxies, and then eventually Earth was this little cesspool of hot water, and the first ray of sunlight somehow activated the first cell of life. And if you really trace it all back, what you're describing, Jen, is exactly the root of the work, which is just the beginning of everything. And like how you had that feeling, you know, when maybe you don't even remember it, maybe when you were conceived, you know. So yeah, that full gamut of experience is there for everybody to experience.
I think that's the perfect way to end our conversation.
Yes,
we've covered all.
Yes, thank you. And it was really a pleasure. And if there's any other follow-up questions, just send them to Jen and I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Gisela. And I can't wait to get everybody out to Los Angeles. I have to say, looking at your studio with the mountains behind you, I wanted to cry. But I can't wait to get back out there. And I so appreciate not only you spending the time with us this afternoon, but for making it possible for Hyperellipsoid to be part of In Vivid Color and now part of the Mints collection. It's just, I can't express appreciation.
Oh my God, well, thank you. Thank you. And it's really been a pleasure. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Gisela. That was brilliant. I really, really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.